Welcome back to Man and Mystery. I guess that's what we're rolling with. What do you think about that? I don't know where it came from, but I was just, it makes sense to me. I think
it works, actually, because really everything is mystery when you get down to the brass tacks of it.
Good response on the last one. I think, well, okay, this is what I wanted to say, because as I was like looking at it and recording it, at some point, I guess I felt like I was trying to offer an apology for orthodoxy. And here's just kind of what I want to say.
Sure.
Is I'm not in any way offering an apology for orthodoxy. That's not the goal here. I really just want people to hear the conversations that we have off mic, and just kind of see, in really any walk of life, if you come across it, then this could be applied. I think that's why talking about even just any life being spiritual, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we're all so maybe that approach versus, and I'm just talking to myself, I'm telling you this about myself. Last episode, the little response that we did get was good, and I think just going on Instagram, the guys were it's cool. I think they're interested, and that's nice. So this episode, I don't know how we're going to do it. I kind of roughly mentioned it to you. Yeah. And I really am depending on you to put it together for us.
We'll figure it out together.
Yeah, yes. When I first came to you, very neurotic, I was so confused as to how to do spirituality. And I think all of us are when approaching life or the spiritual life. And so I kind of wanted to go back to some of the earlier advice that you shared with me, and then maybe we could get into control was the thing that I had to learn, still having to learn. Sure. I don't know what do you think we can start with that?
Well, you were asking questions that need to be asked, that everybody at some point in their lives asks themselves those questions. It always happens under a different set of circumstances for everybody. But that's part of the process that we engage throughout our lives. And it's not just like a one-time thing that we're constantly reassessing. At least we ought to be, right? The saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah. So, and to a certain extent, it's, quote unquote, first world problems, right? Like you have to have a certain amount of leisure on your hands in order to be able to even ask these questions. People who are worried about basic survival don't normally ask these questions, right? They're worried about whether their next meal is going to come from or where they're going to sleep tonight. Yeah. So this is something that once you have a relative amount, and this is kind of funny because it's a contradiction in and of itself, that once you have a little bit of security and comfort and ease in your life is when you begin to start thinking in these terms, that it's almost impossible to even have the capability to ask those questions prior to that point. Yeah. So it's I may have mentioned this to you before. It's one of those things I saw on Facebook years back, and I stole it for a sermon. But it was a thing on Facebook that said, the human body is 90% water, so we're all basically cucumbers with anxiety, And it's true. We all are asking these questions to some extent. It hits everybody in a different way and at a different time. But again, first world problems, right?
Right. I remember going to a restaurant recently, a barbecue joint, and I got pulled pork sandwich, fries, bag of chips, drink.
Sounds delicious.
It's so delicious, right? Well, they left the important part out the bag. They left the pulled pork out the bag. Yeah, so I got back here, no pulled pork, and the first thing I wanted to do was
rage.
Yeah. It's trivial, but I mean, somebody would appreciate to just have a fry or two, or so I have to. So it is almost embarrassing to kind of have these problems, but we do have them nonetheless. And so, since we do have them, I'm just trying to, along with everybody else, how do we get through this contradiction? What's the best way we iron out this thing?
Man, that's a great question, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to it. There's that very trite saying, we have to practice an attitude of gratitude, right? And it is trite, but it's also true. We have to learn to be thankful for the little things. one thing that perhaps our current situation in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis is teaching us is to appreciate the little things, God willing. You know, I think we're in the midst of a great opportunity as a society as a whole and as individuals to reassess how we're living our lives and to concentrate on the things that are most important and to perhaps simplify and refine as we go through. And that's something that perhaps in an age of unmatched wealth, ease, and comfort, it's necessary for us so we can learn how to put this vast quantity of resources which are available to us to the best use.
Yeah. That reminds me of one of the quotes Christendom has is the rich is given to the poor and the poor is given to the rich. Like this relationship.
Exactly. The rich exist for the sake of the poor to help them, and the poor exist for the sake of the rich in order that they might be saved. Yeah, absolutely.
That's such a beautiful perspective because now it gives you, with all this ease and comfort, get through these problems. How can I best use my life to help another or to help my neighbor?
Yeah, St. Basil the Great is even tougher than that. You know, he says basically, anything that you have that is excess is theft.
It's not your, oh goodness.
Yeah, that you've stolen it from the poor because it rightfully belongs to them. You're supposed to be giving it to them. So, you know, that the shoes in your closet are not your own. The bread that you have in your cabinet belongs to someone else. And it's up to you to see that it gets to where it's supposed to be.
Isn't it? So that goes back to the talents that we were discussing back on. He had 5 talents and he used his 5 talents to the commentary that I was reading. It was kind of, he put it as he gave. And so more was given to him because he was constantly turning it over, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting. That can be a tough parable actually, because, you know, the one who goes and buries the talent, right? He has this harsh assessment of the master in there, right? He says,
explain
I
that to me,
knew you were a tough man, that you reap where you did not sow, and all of that. And it's interesting because the master in the parable never denies this charge, right? So if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, wow, I mean, he's kind of a jerk, you know, but the point is that, God, Christ, does reap where he didn't personally sow, right? But that's because we're doing the sowing in our lives.
Boom, I was missing that part. Okay.
It's, of course, it's always to the glory of God. God willing. So, it's a really interesting little twist in there, like that little thorn in the side that you're like, wow, I don't understand.
I didn't.
So,
Sweet. Okay. One of the things, I guess, that led me to you is I ran the logical end to, you know, if I was to be successful and get all this money, surely that can't be it, because I can't remember who I was talking to, but it got around to, surely I wasn't just put here to be a lawyer or a teacher, and I'm not saying those aren't things to be, but if I just came here to get a little bit of money and a title and then a headstone, that's it, you know? So I ran it, you know, if I had all the money in the world, what's the most I could get? A tiger? You know what? But you see, when people start spending their money on crazy stuff, you get bored and you get into like some weird activity. But
well, like they say, money can't buy happiness.
It can,
but it can buy a jet ski. And have you ever seen anybody look sad on a jet ski?
I know one of the first questions I had, we're talking about happiness actually, and you were describing it as, you know, people come to you all the time and they're like, well, I'm not happy, and you're just like, so and so could you explain our addiction to happiness, and what's the reality of things, I guess.
It's a great question because, boy, anything can become an addiction, right? We become addicted to being constantly entertained. We want to always have our little screens in front of us. That a moment of boredom is for us like, oh, the worst thing in the world. And but when there is constant distraction, there is no opportunity for reflection, right? You have to have centeredness. You have to have stillness. You have to have quietness. And when we deprive ourselves of those things, then we're putting ourselves back on that level where we don't have that physical security even, right? To where our minds are unable to fix on one thing in order to really examine ourselves and see where we are. And of course, coming from a Christian perspective, you know, if you're constantly chasing happiness, right, however you define that, then it is a form of hedonism, right? I mean, it has to be. However you're defining, you know, however many pleasure units I can intake today, you know, and to try to minimize the pain units I intake. And again, then that's the question. Well, is that the meaning of life, right? Well, I would say no. You know, from a Christian perspective, obviously not. We talked last week about how we always look to Christ as the example of what it means to be a perfect human being. And clearly, Christ was not interested in maximizing pleasure units and minimizing pain units. He was doing something very different than that. And so we have to keep that in mind if we are comparing our own lives to his. What was he doing? Why was he doing it? What did that mean? And what does it mean for us? And I think the answers to all of those questions are fairly obvious if we actually take the time to stop and examine them. And, you know, I constantly tell people, I said, you know, there's only one time in the Gospels when Christ tells people to be happy. He says, "Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for so they did to your fathers, the prophets before you," you know, or as we do it in church, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And boy, if we're going to take the things that Christ says seriously, which I think we ought to, then we have to consider what that means. That if the only time we should rejoice is when we are suffering for the kingdom, how are we living that in our lives? What does that mean for us? How are we trying to embrace it? And conversely, what are we currently doing in our lives to try to avoid that? And how do we get rid of that? You know, that's the self-improvement program we should be on. But
it's a lot of freedom in that. It is painful. I think one of the when coming into orthodoxy, the idea, as I think that you just said this, and I mean, it's just so the reminder that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, and he never deprives us of anything that we need for our salvation. And so when we look at the whole of our lives, there is always opportunity to participate in his life. At least that's what I see.
Well, there's also a certain amount of healthy self-doubt we need to have as we're going through these things, because we never really understand anything while it happens. We talked about this last week, right? That pride about like, well, if I had been in the garden, or if I had been Peter, you know, I never would have abandoned Christ, right? The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who said, man only understands life backwards, but he must live it forwards, right? it's a very quick way of saying that we need to practice reflection, because it's so many times that we can only see, looking backward, what has brought us to where we are. Like you said earlier, like, man, I was crazy. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. And, I picked up the phone and it's like, yeah. And so if you hadn't been at that state in your life, then we wouldn't be sitting here recording a podcast right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's so many things like that in our lives that we have no understanding of when they're happening to us, and then you even have to rephrase, how do we approach regret in our lives? What does it mean? Like, how can we even understand that as a concept if everything has served to bring us to where we are and to, God willing, a greater love of God and of each other?
Yeah.
So was it bad? Well, it might have felt really bad at the time, right? But was it objectively a bad thing to have had happen to you? Well, who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah.
And even back to the conversation we had last week, what we consider good isn't.
Well, and there's so much of that. And there is a maturation process that has to take place in order to be appreciative of that, because, man, we don't know what we're doing as parents. No. Like, we're just doing the best we can.
I'm saying, like I'm a parent.
We're trying to figure this out as we go, and by and large, perhaps to speak to a larger point. I mean, yes, there are some people who are just, have more bad inside them, who do things purposely to hurt other people. But most of the time, you are not like at the center of a worldwide plot to make your life hard, right? Like, number one, people aren't that organized, and number two, you're not that important. So, excuse me. So we have to keep that in mind too, that most of the time, like, you didn't get your pulled pork sandwich, right? Well, nobody was like, I'm not going to give this guy the sandwich.
He's
exactly.
Here now, guys. Forget it.
So we have to keep that in mind too, and that's hugely important for helping us realize. I think that just keeping in mind, you're not that important. Yeah. Most of the things that happen to you are not the result of some devious scheme to make your life worse. But again, like we talked about last week, I'm the protagonist in my movie. I'm the main character, right? So obviously this is all part of the plot line, moving the story forward. And it's like, no, not at all,
And there's we get reminders of that, actually, when life kind of, again, I had a certain idea about where I was at life and my relationships around me. I had an idea that, lone wolf, nobody understands me. Then, I get to hang out with my friends, and it's just like, well, dude, stop tripping, Yeah. It's not what you think it is a lot of the times, even. Yeah. That's life a lot of the times. It might be that complex. Maybe we could segue into the illusion of control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because those things are kind of tied together, right? Yeah. I think that, when you are at the center of your own story, and then you're like, well, I'm going to control this, I'm going to do that. And again, boy, the current situation is teaching us a lot about what we control. I mean, golly, you might not even get toilet paper when you go to the store, right? And what do we actually exercise any influence over? In our lives? And there's not a lot. No. There's not a lot. And now, obviously, we can control the important things. We can control how we respond. We can control how we react to other people. We can control whether or not we continue to love others the way we are called to love them, whether we accept freely the gift of God's love for us. All of these things. Again, everything that's actually important, we still control. But golly, again, cucumbers with anxiety. Like, how much of our day do we spend worrying about or thinking about things that if they do happen, we wouldn't be able to influence? It's like, it might rain today. Okay, but you don't control that. So take an umbrella, or take a jacket. Yeah. That's all you can do. And then quit worrying about it, because there's literally nothing you can do.
Nothing.
But if we don't spend time in reflection, then we're not going to be able to even control those things.
Yeah.
So like if your house is dirty and you drop a pair of socks on the floor, you might not even notice the socks, right? But if you clean your house, then you notice the socks immediately. Yeah? And then you can pick them up and do something about them. Yeah. And we have to do the same with ourselves. We've got to clear ourselves of all the mental debris floating in our heads, because otherwise when we have something into our heads that shouldn't be there, a reaction, an impulse, a desire for something, then we may not even be aware of it until it's too late. Yeah? So
maybe flesh that out, like, because that was one of the things that I couldn't get a handle on, is my thought life, and that's where the whole thing starts.
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, most of us find ourselves having to work from the end back to the beginning, because we're not in the habit of doing this. But this comes from the Desert Fathers, that this idea that sin starts as a thought. It always starts as a thought. There is something that will occur to us, and that's like that dirty pair of socks on the floor, right? And if your house is clean, if your mind is focused and attentive, then you notice it right away. But you might not notice it right away, which is unfortunately the point most of us are at. There's an old monastic saying, there's nothing wrong with the birds in the air. The problem is when they make a nest in your hair. Yeah. And so, obviously the meaning is that the birds are like thoughts, right? We have all manner of things flit into our heads throughout the day. Things that we don't even control. The fancy word for this in Greek is logismi. And it really means just like a little thought. Things come into our heads in and out all day long. And we don't always control that, and that's fine. The problem is that if we fixate on one, right, we're inviting it to make a nest. We're bringing it into our heads. And so this is kind of the second stage after the thought occurs. It would be coupling, right? You're starting to entertain the thought. This is where the difficulty begins, because in some ways, you've now already let it into your head, into your house. Like, if you know that there's a guy knocking at your door who wants to beat you up, like, why would you open the door and try to reason with him, right? The best thing to do is keep him out. So, but at that point where you're like even engaging the thought, you've probably already lost the battle, right? Because now it's something you're turning over in your head. So that next stage then would be that acceptance or attempted rejection of that thought. That's where you're actively like doing the battle with it. Once like you've realized, I'm entertaining this thought, you're starting to battle it, right? God willing, we can reject, but sometimes we can't. And so we have this assent to the thought. We decide we're going to do whatever the thought was, right? And you still may be able to turn away from it at this point. There may be circumstances outside your control, right? Like, you say you want to go to McDonald's and you go and it's closed. You're like, I'm not getting McDonald's now, right? But you had already given assent to the thought. And then so once it takes place, then now the sin has taken place, right? Of course, we can say in some ways the sin already began, right? Just like we were talking about. And then once this becomes a habit, that's what becomes what we would call a passion, or in Western parlance, a vice, right? Like the repeated giving in to this sinful thought is what leads you into that state of captivity, where it sounds weird, but you are captive to it, right? Like, think about, you're a former smoker now, right?
Yeah.
I'm also a former smoker. Yeah. If you have to have a cigarette, are you in charge?
No.
I'm
just like, I'm sorry.
You're not.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
That you have become enslaved to whatever that desire is, because you can't tell it no. It's in charge. You're not in charge. And so this is what we mean by being enslaved to the passions of the flesh. That, people don't view it that way, but it is. It's a loss of freedom that came about through your own willingness to turn yourself over to it. So, again, most of us find ourselves in the position where now we're in captivity and we're having to look back and be like, oh man, right? But all of these things begin as a possibility, as a thought. So,
man, I think what I'm starting to, even in training or trying to, Nepsis?
Yes. So it means vigilance, basically, is the classic Greek interpretation. Yeah, but you'll see it translated variously in the Bible as, being watchful or sobriety. All of those things.
How many suggestions, I guess, and how subtle or deceptive they can be.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I oftentimes I get, especially with anxiety, I hear, people are like, man, I'm always thinking about this, and this, and I was under the impression that the thoughts, all of them, belonged to me. And I can see how I behave in how I behave. And I look at the thoughts that come in and how ugly or nasty or foreign some may be to what I would actually do.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I had to take into consideration that they don't belong to me, and the freedom just in realizing that. Oh, actually, I wouldn't run over my neighbor's dog.
Sure.
Just whatever.
Yeah. Well, and this is, obviously from a Christian viewpoint, that we would look at these as, attacks of the demons, right? That they can't make you do anything, but they can plant the thought, right? I don't know if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters.
Just started reading it.
Yeah. So if you look at that, obviously for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with it, it's all supposedly written from the perspective of a senior demon trying to help his nephew out and become a better, quote unquote, better demon in order to influence his charge. And so you can see that it's all about planting the idea and getting them to think certain ways so that those thoughts will lead to action. And so the best, again, it's kind of that judo move, right? Yeah. Like, the best way to deal with those thoughts is to let them go, to not try to wrestle with them. Yeah. Because once you start, you've already moved up into like the third stage, where
just like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because the thought comes and you begin to think about it, and then you're like, I don't know if I should do this or not, blah, blah, blah. And so you're already like halfway through these stages. You're closer to actually doing it than not. Yeah. So the best thing to do is to be aware of the thoughts you're having without necessarily engaging them. This is kind of like, this is what is commonly called in modern psychology and therapy, metacognition. Okay. Thinking about thinking. And that's the point that we need to be at, so that we can examine the thoughts we're having without engaging the thoughts themselves. It sounds weird. I get it. but
no, it really
this is the challenge for us. Because if we are not aware of that, then we're already moving ourselves along that path. Yeah. You know, there's a saying, don't believe everything you think. I love that.
Yeah.
Because it's so true, right? Everything in orthodoxy is both and. It's never either or. Yeah. So there's the common saying, like, you are not your thoughts, right? But then, like, you know, Elder Cleopas has this book, Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives. And it's like, well, how are these both true? And it's like, well, because this is what happens if we can't separate and take that step back in order to perform the higher cognitive function of examining our thoughts without engaging our thoughts, as it were. So
I want to come back to that. But I think, so even in speaking to sobriety and control, I think just recently I had the epiphany, just how much things are not in our control. I had to bring it to a very, very, very like internal level that I couldn't even control a thought, because I got to the point where I was like, you know, well, I'll just meditate on the good things about Christ.
Yeah, sure, whatever. Right?
Yeah, right.
And, like, and that lasted 5 seconds, and then I was thinking about dinner.
Boom. Yep.
And then, exactly.
And it's... That should be, how humbling is that? You know, I can't even control a thought. That's something that's happening within me, let alone, you know, everything else that's external to me. One of the things that I remember you telling me, because I was struggling with, how do I gauge my relationships with non-Christians or, you know, this? How? Because
you gauge them based on how you're treating them, right? That's, I mean, that's what it comes down to.
But one of the things that set us off and that could send us into unpleasant reactions is how they may respond to us, or directly or indirectly, whatever the case may be. But I remember you telling me that, you know, there's just a form of pride. You know, we want to control others. It's subtle, but we wish we could control how others treated us. And
yeah, it is. It's absolutely. It's a desire for control of another human being in whatever way, shape, or form.
What realm do we step into?
Yeah, because you're demanding, basically, that this person have a specific reaction to you. And that's another way of trying to control people, right? You know, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter.
No.
You know, even with, I mean, people, we talk about atheists, non-believers, blah, 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 all that stuff. Yeah. You know, I've heard this said before. I didn't make this up, but Father Michael Alexa, he makes the talk circuit on occasion. He's really good. I can listen to him talk all day. Yeah. But, you know, he's very big on this missionary work and evangelism and stuff like that. And it's all about finding common ground with people. Yeah. It always is. Because if we don't have anything in common with each other, then there's nowhere to build from. And, you know, he says, you know, he'll talk to people who self-identify as atheists. And he'll say, well, why don't you tell me about that? You know, he doesn't try to challenge or anything, but, you know, because most people have really wild conceptions about God, and that's why they reject them. Yep. And he says, okay, so tell me about, you know, God then. And the person will say something, and he'll say, well, I don't believe that about God either. You know, what else? You know, and he'll go through that. And basically, you know, his point is that the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in that God either, you know, and there's a reason for that. So, sweet. Again, it's always about finding the common ground with people. And most people have rejected a God that was foisted upon them by well-meaning people who have largely misunderstood what's going on. It's so funny. You mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast the word heretic, right? And I love, you know, Father John Bear, whom we were talking about earlier this morning. he's very big on this because the word heresy, comes from a Greek word heresis, which means choice. The idea is that you have to fully understand the teaching and then reject it in favor of something else. Yeah. You choose something different. Yeah. And so I think he had said to me one time, he's like, "Don't worry, you're not smart enough to be a heretic," right? Like,
yeah, okay, so, I love it. Yeah.
But the point being is that most people aren't heretics, right, because they've never actually encountered what we teach. Yeah. And so they're not rejecting that. Mm-hmm. They don't understand it, and they're like, "Oh, I don't like that. I'm picking something different." They've just never even been exposed to it. So the word heretic gets thrown around all the time, and it's like, this isn't a word we should really pull out, you know? It's just not accurate in this day and age. Mm-hmm. Like, in the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, they were having these debates. There was a fully formulated position, and people were saying, "No, I don't believe that. I believe this." Okay, then fine, you're a heretic. but in this day and age, I mean, boy, that word should probably just be put back in the drawer and not taken out. Yeah. So
it's so much grace that you could give to people for that. Not that it's even yours to give, honestly, but lighten up.
Well, and again, Christ says, to him whom much is given, much will be required, right? So God is going to judge us based on what we know, and
what we think we know.
Well, exactly, exactly. But if you didn't have that opportunity, then I'm pretty sure God's going to go a whole lot lighter on you than he's going to go on me, for example. Mm-hmm. So
you probably don't believe the same things. That's what makes people.
Well, even take it to what you were talking. Oh, nobody understands me, and then you hang out with your friends, right? This is why the grace that we should give everybody. You should just say, yes, they don't understand me. Who can? Do you understand yourself, right? Like half the time we do silly things, right? St. Paul says, the good I wish to do, I do not do, right? So on. So the idea, of course, is that we have to extend that grace to people in our daily interactions, because you never know what's happening. You don't know what's happening with them, and they don't know what's happening with you. Yeah. So, even these, so-called easy categorizations of people are just, by and large, harmful, really.
How do you mean? What categorizations?
Well, any which way. Like, we talked about this a little bit last week, like the way we prejudge people. Yeah. The way we try to, right? Because our brains are constantly scanning. We see something, we want to interpret it through whatever filter or lens we have in our brains, and then it allows us to stop thinking. Right? True. We go, you are in column C. I'm done. All right. I don't have to think about it anymore. And that's harmful, because then we can't encounter people as individuals and respect that individuality of the person the way we want them to do the same to us, and that we get upset when they don't, right? Yeah. They're, he just thought I'm, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
I can see it in just people who are in my age group. There's this, we want people to accept us for who we are, but we don't. As soon as you step outside, as soon as you step outside of normality, you don't listen to this, you don't wear this, you don't do this, you don't do that, and that's
the pre-approved. The pre-approved ways to be an individual.
It's so
you
stupid.
have to conform to being an individual.
It's so stupid. It's so stupid. I always say, we do all that we can to fit in.
Well, it's that sense of belonging that we're looking for, right? Even if it's a false sense or whatever the case may be, right? There's the safety in being a member of the group. Yeah. And we are programmed that way. That's the way we're created, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're social animals. In Genesis, God says it is not good for man to be alone, right? So we're always seeking ways to not be alone, right? Which is a good thing. But in order to do it in a healthy way, you need to spend some time alone, because you need to know who you are really and truly because otherwise we want to fit in to whatever group may give us that sense of security and comfort, right? This is why people join gangs or join fraternities or whatever. I mean, it's all the same thing. It's a desire for a sense of belonging, to fulfill that social calling which we have been given by God. Yeah. And when we do it, again, from a reflective perspective, then it can be healthy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess one of the things that's setting in, I don't know, I say that a lot. One of the things, that's how I preface everything. But seriously, it's so many one of the things. When I'm not, let's say I'm praying for something and I'm not necessarily getting what I want, trying to control the Lord. But the reality is I'm always in this sense of waiting for the Lord.
I mean, we should be, right? I mean, he is the one who is to come, right? And he will come for all of us at some point, whether it's at the end of days or if it's at the end of our days, right? The time is coming.
It's always coming.
So, yeah.
So even if we go to, I had to think about it at a momentary level, that let's say I'm just afflicted or there's a thought that happens, even in the moments, it's really what I'm saying. Even in the moments, I'm always in this place of waiting, or that's the disposition that I want, I suppose. Is even if I don't,
watchfulness.
Yeah, that I don't, it's okay. Because, and I don't know what this is, but I do know that when I'm undergoing these things, however many times I undergo it, nothing goes to waste is what I'm getting at. Nothing goes to waste. And it's like little by little by little by little, but he, in his loving kindness, he just keeps carving us out of the world. And I don't know, I've really grown to attach myself to him being the physician and the church being the hospital. It's so it helps understanding the real problem, I suppose, the real problem that we have.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, boy, that's I think the only way you can view him. I think, and perhaps to just help illuminate that for our listeners, that in the West, the prevalent image is of a judge, right? And he's dispensing divine justice. Whereas in the East, he's dispensing healing. The scalpel is employed. Absolutely. If you've had surgery, right? Even when they put you under and bring you back and all that stuff, you've still got to heal. It hurts. Right? But it's for healing. It's not like you don't go and the doctor punishes you, right? He's not, I mean, God willing, he's not sadistic like that, right?
Thank you. And I don't know. There's a reason to reject something a sadistic.
Oh, absolutely.
And I had to get to that. I didn't. When I really thought about it, the one that I may have accepted at a point in time, I was like, well, that's a little sadistic. It's tough for me to. It's just like, if you like that, man, I'll go do my own thing. And I get it. 100%. 100%. I get it. So, well, sorry.
And I don't know. That has to do a lot with the way we view ourselves too, right? That God created man in his image and likeness, but we frequently try to create a God in our image and likeness, right? And so if we think we're righteous and we're, just and all that we want a God who's like that, that, when somebody forgets our pulled pork sandwich, we want a God who will throw him into hell the way we want to throw him into hell, right? But when we focus inwardly and we see just how short we come, then I would argue that the vision of a God who heals is much more comforting.
Absolutely. It helps with your days. Trust me. I mean, but
it's our only hope. Yeah. It's also our only hope. Don't pray for a just God. A just God will throw me into the fires of hell because I've done nothing to merit going to heaven. Right? Yeah. I've done nothing. Pray for a merciful God.
Yeah. Seriously.